You look like doo-doo. Joe looked up. An old man with wise eyes and a kind smile was standing in the rear doorway of a store holding a sandwich. Joe smiled acknowledgment of his comment. So I've just been told, Zach. You must be hungry. You want half my footlong? Joe chuckled in spite of his blues. Zach, did I just hear you offer me 6 inches? 'Cause if that's a sincere offer, I'm going to have to do the same thing I used to do in prison when I got an offer like that. Oh, and what was that? Beat the shit out of you. Beat up your best friend? An old man, no less? You are bitter. Zach ambled over and sat down next to Joe, totally unconcerned that he was sitting in a pile of garbage in the middle of an alley. He saw Joe clutching the old photograph. You miss him a lot, don't you, Joe? Oh, more than I can say. It's preying on your mind. That's why you look like something the cat wouldn't be caught dragging in. Joe turned and eyeballed Zachariah. Why is everybody so concerned about my appearance all of a sudden? I'm a homeless person, not a spokesperson. I'm supposed to look like this, Zach. It's my job. I am the reason when the folks drive by and see me on the sidewalk and how very pathetic I am. They count their blessings and say, there, but for the grace of God go I. Zach, I serve a function. I make everybody else's life look good by comparison. Oh, Joe, you are so full of it. You'll do anything to justify being a lazy-ass white man with attitude, who's too lethargic to get his life together. Zach, that's why I came to see you. I can always count on you for kind words and support. Zach stood up and brushed himself off. Hate to be the one to break it to you, Joe, but you're sitting in dog shit. Now get up, shake a leg. Joe got up slowly, scraping the poop off his shoe onto the dumpster. Seriously, Zach, I need a favor. They headed into the back of a Salvation Army thrift shop that Zach managed. Cue music. The song, Puttin' on the Ritz, as Joe and Zach embarked on a satire of those makeover montages so popular in Hollywood movies. But given the limited clothing choices for Joe in the Salvation Army, it was as comical as it was pathetic. 60s bell-bottoms, Nehru jackets, double-knit leisure suits, pimp shoes, army boots, flip-flops, Hawaiian shirts, tactical guerrilla camouflage. But between Zach and Joe, they managed to put together a passable outfit. Joe was not the height of fashion, but he looked acceptable. Simi had been right. It probably wasn't the kind of sad errand someone should do alone. But Eve had been right, too. She would summon the strength to get through it somehow. After all, Eve thought, as she sat in first class in a window seat, staring down at the familiar geography below. She'd gotten through this every year on this day for years now. As the plane prepared to land, Eve sighed deeply, obviously dreading this. Hiding his face under his hat, Joe ambled back into the mall, right past the Bubba security guard from before, who didn't even recognize him. Joe covertly flipped the bird at the guard as he passed by. It had been a long time since Joe had been in a toy store. He was, frankly, overwhelmed by the selection, the cornucopia, the new technology of toys. The clerk, a pimply young kid who looked like he might be stoned, wasn't much interested in Joe, but walked over when Joe hailed him and asked a variety of questions about all these weird new toys. Handheld video games, blaster guns, transformers, weird kinds of globs and blobs in gross containers that served who knows what purpose. Joe shook his head. Whatever happened to Slinky? Silly Putty? Cootie? Joe strolled the aisle of action figures and toy soldiers and micro-assassins. He studied with fascination the range of miniature weapons from good old-fashioned grenades to deep space warfare gadgets, strangely disturbed about how much they'd proliferated since the days of G.I. Joe. Joe left the basket of toys he'd gathered and got the hell out of there. He just got the hell out of that toy store. And meanwhile, far away in another toy store, Eve filled her basket. Teddy bears, a baby doll, a glider, assorted toys. Eve stood in the checkout line. The clerk smiled pertly. "Someone's having a birthday." Eve did not look at the clerk when she answered. Something like that. Joe was in a funk, too. His mood was not quite as bleak and black as Eve's, but he had started this project with such high hopes, and now he didn't know quite how to entertain the twins, to get something for them that wouldn't... Joe was confused. All he knew for sure was that he had to respect what Eve was doing with these kids, the path she'd chosen, until he made up his mind for sure whether it was very right, very smart, or absolutely the wrong thing. Joe was now back where he started, sitting in that alley by the dumpster, just looking a bit more dapper. He stared at the unspent cash in his wallet, and then he looked across the street at a construction site. Something caught his eye and made him smile. And a few minutes later, Joe was lugging a big burlap sack down the street. People stopped and stared at him. He was an odd sight. Eve stood in a florist shop, staring at the rainbow of blooms. She bit her lip, trembling a little, smiling at the florist. I'd like a dozen pink sweetheart roses and some baby's breath mixed in with that, and some of those blue carnations, mix them with the lavender daisies. That would be pretty. What else? Do you have any sprays of you? We need a little green in there. And meanwhile, back to Joe's plan. Zach, driving a Salvation Army thrift shop truck, stopped just outside Eve's estate to let Joe out. Joe had a bunch of burlap sacks and a plan in mind. A grand plan it was. He was so hoping the twins would like it. A noble old church, its spire jutting into the low-hanging clouds, sat nestled in the hills of this peaceful, beautiful place that could be anywhere. Eve walked solemnly, like she herself might be one of the ghosts, past the rows of old headstones until she stopped under a spreading oak tree. She stared at two newer stones, one pink marble, the other gray-blue. Then, lovingly, she placed the pink sweetheart roses at the foot of the pink headstone. Noella Angelica Hartswick, born December 25th, 1986, died October 31st, 1994. Born on Christmas Day, we always knew you were our angel. Now you are God's angel. We can still hear you singing. Barely holding it together, Eve then placed the blue carnations and daisies at the foot of the blue-gray headstone. Christopher Arthur Hartswick, born April 4th, 1983, died October 31st, 1994. You dreamed of being a pilot or an astronaut. Now you have angel's wings. You can fly anywhere. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings, reached out my hand and touched the face of God. Eve sat on her knees looking at the headstones, and she finally broke down, sobbing a torrent that racked her little body. Then, after a moment, someone put his hand on her shoulder. It was a distinguished man with intense eyes, gray-flecked hair, wearing dark mourning clothes as well. Eve looked at him. They embraced, sobbing into each other's arms. Back at the fortress, Joe used a rope to drag the burlap sacks up the side of the wall and over. He continued this process over and over, smiling the whole time. He labored hard, Joe did. He worked up a sweat, and by the time he fell asleep that night in his encampment under the bridge, he could only think of two things: how sore his muscles were, and where the heck had Eve disappeared to? She hadn't come home that night. He had checked in on them through his trusty binoculars and seen only Simmy and the twins, but no Eve. She hadn't come home all night. Joe wondered as he was drifting off to sleep if she'd been on a date. Then he wondered if Eve had spent the night with her date, and then he wondered if Eve was in love. All of this depressed him very much and did much to take the wind out of his sails and his excited anticipation over the project he'd created for the twins. The next morning, Eve's plane touched down around noon, and as soon as Eve was on home turf, she was in her functional/denial mode. Not 1 minute had gone by before she was on her cell phone again, making deals, giving orders as she waited impatiently for her luggage. Between ordering someone on her cell phone, she ordered a porter to help her with her bags. In no time, she was on her way back to her life. The hired car from the airport stopped in front of Eve's office building. She thanked him curtly, paid him, then hurried back to her empire. Meanwhile, Simmy was back on the home front, and she couldn't help but noticing that the twins were beside themselves all morning waiting for play hour. And their astonishing lack of curiosity or concern about their mother's absence was odd indeed. The twins were squirming as Simmy dressed them to go outside for play hour. "I swear I never seen you two so antsy to go outside. I thought you told me it was getting boring."
It was, Simmy, but yesterday we found a troll under the bridge.
Dirk glared at Mary and jabbed her to hush.
"Just a raccoon, Simmy, but Mary thought it was a troll 'cause she'd never seen a raccoon before. Come on, Mary, we'd better get going."
The twins rushed out the door, Simmy watching nervously. "Don't you play with that raccoon. It might have rabies." Deep in the woods, Joe paced nervously, waiting. He heard the kids whooping and laughing. He smiled like a kid himself when he saw them emerge from the woods. They stopped when they saw him.
"Hey, Mr. Troll, you're here, just like we asked. Did you bring us anything to play with, Mr. Troll?"
Joe stammered, feeling awkward. Strange for Joe. "Well, yeah, I mean, no, that is, I didn't buy it. Well, I didn't know it. Actually, kids, I built you something." Joe gestured to the tiniest island in the stream a few yards from the shore. It was an astonishing sandcastle. The entire island had been transformed into a sandlot with a magnificent turreted castle on it. But more than that, Joe had acquired glitter and sparkles and shimmery bits, along with flags for the turrets, creatures for the moat, and wee tiny brave soldiers to guard the fortress. Dirk and Mary waded across the shallow stream and stared, breathless. It was wonderful. It was the beginning. The afternoon passed all too quickly. Joe smiled as he watched the kids romp back to the house. He turned to go back to his little hidden campout area and stopped short when he saw what was at his feet. A raccoon in a rusty old trap, its neck snapped. An hour later, Joe had hitched back to the Salvation Army. He was sitting in the office, distraught, talking to Zach. Zach was trying to puzzle it all out. "And you're sure that this Eve didn't set the traps? From what you've told me, I wouldn't put it past her. She doesn't want anybody on her property." "Zach, of course she didn't. She gives those kids free run of the grounds. You think she'd do that knowing there's big old sets of rusty jaws just waiting to snap at their little legs?" "Oh, you're right. Gives me shivers just thinking about it. We gotta do something, Joe, and fast." "I know, Zach. I've been nuts worrying about those kids since this morning. Those traps must be there from before Eve owned it. And God knows how many more there are set. I thought about leaving her a note, but then she'll wonder who was on her grounds." "Of course you don't leave her a note, stir up trouble. Well, the solution is easy enough, Joe. You just leave that raccoon. What'd you do with it, anyway?" "I buried it, along with the trap." "Well, dig it up, put it where the twins will find it, and have them show it to their mom, still promising not to say anything about you. They really haven't told their mom about you?" "Nope. They still think the magic troll will disappear if my name is uttered." "You're too much, Joe. You know that." "Oh, no, Zach. I mean, you're the one who came up with the brilliant solution. Just have the kids tell Eve. So simple. Why didn't I think of that?" 'Cause you're obviously in love with a woman, and a man don't think straight when he's in love." Meanwhile, back at Eve's office, she was astonished at how thoroughly matters had fallen apart in her brief absence. Oh, Eve knew she was a bitch and a tyrant, but it was precisely those qualities that kept all those people employed and kept her company's stock soaring. So everyone loved her at the same time that they hated her. But right now her mood was fouler and her behavior ruder than anyone could remember. But the reason did have to do with that sweet part of Eve. She missed her babies. She hadn't seen them in over 24 hours, and that almost never happened, and she hated that state of affairs. It made her nervous and scared and shaky, terrified that something had happened to them while she was gone and they were out from under her protective... Oh, Eve swore at the memo Joan handed her. Then Eve went to her private office, dialed a number, and waited. Back at the house, Simmy's vibrating beeper went off under her layers of clothes. She slipped away from the kids who'd just fallen asleep after graham crackers and prayers. Simmy went to her room, removed a cell phone in its charger hidden under the bed. She called Eve. Back at Eve's office, Eve picked up the phone. She sighed heavily before speaking, and Simmy could already read Eve's mood. "Simmy, it's me, Eve." "Well, of course it's me. Who else beeps you? And Simmy, are the twins okay?" "Yes, Eve, they were okay when you called to check last night, and today at noon, and today at 3. Okay, you've made your point. Anyway, Simmy, tonight is going to run longer than I thought." "No problem, Eve. The kids conked out early. They're already sound asleep." "Already? It's only 8 o'clock. They've been playing so hard in the woods lately. I mean, they're pooping out earlier and earlier. Anyway, everything's quiet here. You stay as late as you need to." "Oh, Simmy, what would I do without you?" "Well, don't even think about that, 'cause you'll never have to find out." Simmy hung up, shook her head. Eve, Eve, Eve. And for reasons she could not quite divine, Simmy opened her trunk, dug around, and found what she was looking for. A scrapbook filled with photographs and memorabilia. She opened it and stared at the pictures of herself, Simmy, in younger days, and at her little babies. It made her so blue, Simmy was singing a sad song to herself under her breath without realizing it. And just a stone's throw away, literally, Joe, too, was settling in for the night, and he, too, pulled out an old battered photo album from his backpack and perused it. Pictures of a younger Joe, a happier Joe with a beautiful family. Joe turned a page and saw a picture of himself in uniform. A purple heart on a ribbon for a bookmark marked the page. Joe gently closed the book, shut his eyes, and wondered what the hell had become of his life, and his happiness, and his heart. And Eve! Where in blazes was Eve? Eve had finally ended the endless day and headed back to her car after a long night at the office. Dear old Reedy Johnson, with his ancient smile, leaned out, a silver flask in one hand, and gestured to Eve. "Can't stand it! I cannot stand it!" Eve was startled. "Excuse me, what?" "Seeing a good friend so cranky and worried, on my birthday, no less." "Reedy, I didn't know it was... Well, why didn't you tell me? I would have... "Oh, hush up, Eve. Just come on in and have a piece of cake." Eve walked into his humble office and peeked in. 2 Twinkies with candles. Eve was underwhelmed. "Reedy, this is your birthday cake? This is your party?" "Yeah, Hank on day watch, he remembered. Wasn't that kind of him? Anyway, I thought you might have a slice and a nip." He winked and offered her the flask, and without batting an eye or wiping the rim, Eve smiled and took a swig. She could use a drink about now. And besides, the twins were sound asleep. They chatted for a bit and drank. Not too much, though. Eve was driving. And as Eve studied the pictures of the children on the wall and made small talk with Reedy about them, Eve thought to herself how fascinating it was that some people could have so little, live so humbly, yet be so happy. And then, she thought, maybe the key in life is not what you manage to get, but what you manage to not lose in the process, to not lose that you love. Reedy didn't miss a thing, though. He saw Eve was distant, and he knew she was haunted. They were toasting, and as Reedy blew out his candles, Eve clapped her hands. "Did you make a wish, Reedy?"
Yes, ma'am, I did.
"Well, what did you wish? And don't give me that nonsense about not telling what you wished for. You're too old to believe in that kind of silliness."
Well, Miss Eva, I wasn't even thinking of balking at your question. What I wished for is that my good friend Miss Eve, whatever was torturing her, would run away so she'd stop being so driven all the time, so she could stop and enjoy life like I do.
Reedy, you wasted a wish on me?
Oh, you see, Eve, that's just the whole point of the wish, so you'd stop feeling like you was the kind of woman that wishes was wasted on.
Eve stared at him, tears in her eyes. She hugged him. He accepted the affection sheepishly, then pulled out a little plastic knife.
"Now let's eat up before these Twinkies dry up."
Joe was asleep under the bridge by the time Eve finally got home. He had fallen into an exhausted sleep, seasoned with frantic worry about those damn traps, and he was dreaming fitfully. Vietnam, a raid on a village, a My Lai massacre kind of hell. Thatched huts are set on fire, pigs and chickens oink and squeal and cluck, humans scream in terror as American soldiers scatter fire on innocent peasants. Joe, now 28 years younger, just 17, is part of this hell. There's mass confusion. He screams epithets. He runs into a hut and looks at the slaughtered bodies of women and children and realizes what he has done. Joe screams again and awakes from his nightmare. Eve was just letting herself into the A-frame when she could have sworn she heard a faint screaming echoing through her woods, but then nothing. She told herself it was from beyond her stone walls. That kind of thing happened from time to time, and there were no more sounds of violence or disturbance, no sirens. Eve prayed it would go away, then ran in to check on her sleeping twins, too exhausted to worry about what or whom had broken the still, peaceful night. Joe awoke the next morning frantic, trying to remember where he had buried that dead raccoon. He spent hours digging with no luck, and by noon the entire area was littered with holes, and Joe was scratching his head. He tried one more place. Oh, pay dirt. He found the dead raccoon with the trap still on its leg, and then he heard the sound of the twins. He looked around frantically, placed the raccoon in the bushes, marking it with a rock, just as he heard the whoop and holler of the kids dashing through the woods. He waved at them. Joe didn't even realize that had it been a week or two later and the leaves all fallen from the trees, Eve would have been able to see him engaging in this bizarre comedy to avert a tragedy. She was pacing, staring out the window on the second floor of her modern house, barking at a city official. "I don't understand it. God damn it, it's my property. What the hell right does the city have to... No, don't tell me how to talk. Just explain why the hell the gas company needs to come nosing around on my property. Oh, all right. Just make sure you talk to me before you put one foot on my property, or I'll sue this city into bankruptcy."
Ew.
The kid squealed as Joe held up the stiff, dead, bloodied raccoon, the trap still clamped to its torso, its eyes bugging out. Joe put the raccoon in a burlap sack. "Kids, I got these rubber gloves I want both of you to wear. It's very important you don't touch that poor dead thing. And show it to your mother so she can make sure that no one else gets caught in the trap. And whatever you do, don't mention me." When suddenly there was an agonized yelping, the scream that only an animal in agony can make. It was the dog, Mr. Clampett, caught in a trap. The twins started screaming too, running towards the sound of it, Joe following. "No, kids! Kids, come back!" Simmy and Eve, working in the house, both looked up when they heard the screaming, then ran outside. Meanwhile, on the other side of the clearing, Joe ran after the kids, trying to call them back. "Kids, don't look!" But it was too late. The kids saw their dog writhing in agony, the rusty metal jaws clamped to its leg. Joe pushed ahead of them. He knelt down by the dog and started to pry the trap off as the children kept screaming. With one pull, Joe yanked off the trap and the dog's leg was freed. The dog bounded up and, in great agony, ran back towards the house, limping and dragging his injured leg behind him. The dog ran past Simmy and Eve, who were running in the direction of the screaming children. The children came following the dog into the house. Simmy and Eve ran into the house after them. And so close, yet so far away, Joe watched helpless, screaming towards the heavens. Inside the house, Eve and Simmy frantically started to tend to the dog, at the same time that they calmed the children and tried to answer their questions. Eve was grabbing a blanket for the dog. "It's going to be okay, babies." Simmy, who was holding Mr. Clampett, looked up at Eve. "You don't know that. Don't tell him what you don't know." As she talked, Simmy was taking control of matters, stopping the dog's bleeding by wrapping the gash and directing the kids. "You two kids, run to the bathroom, get some clean towels. Eve, you bring the car around." Eve looked at Simmy, astonished that she was barking orders, astonished at the orders Simmy gave. "What are you talking about? Bring the car around, Simmy. You know I can't have the twins see the car." "You want the dog to die?" Simmy whispered angrily. "Well, of course not, Simmy. I'll stay here and finish. You bring the car, but just up to the gate. Get the dog to the vet, and I'll stay here with the twins, and somehow—" "Eve, I can't take the dog to the vet. I've got to go open the church and lead the meeting." "Simmy, you can miss one meeting." "Excuse me, Eve, but you do not, repeat, do not leave 100 drunks out on the sidewalk in the cold, waiting for a meeting that might not happen. Some of those folks are a heartbeat away from a drink, and that meeting is all that keeps them sober. And it's my job, honey, to keep those doors open and start things up. And no, Eve, you take the dog." "But, Simmy, the man from the gas company will be here any minute with his truck, and if I'm not here—" Eve was sobbing and staring down at Mr. Clampett, who, it seemed too, was crying. And in that heartbeat, Eve wondered, do dogs cry? Do dogs really weep? Our lives had become unmanageable, and we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Simmy pulled Eve aside, her eyes blazing in a rare fit of anger. "Eve, I'm there for you day and night, 24 hours a day, and you know that. I don't care about the money you pay me. That's not why I do this, and you know that." I know that, Simmy, but let me finish. You always do that. I hate it when you do that. You get all apologetic. Sorry, but then you don't change your ways, honey. You just go right back to it. Now let me finish. Eve, all I've ever asked is that I get my Tuesday nights and my Sunday meetings, that they're important to me. "I know that, Simmy." "Oh, hush up. You sound like a broken record." "Eve, you know how I feel about this strange arrangement you have, but I don't press it because they're your babies and it's your right to decide. And I know you're in a lot of pain, and mostly I feel I owe you. But sometimes, like today, you can't make a phone call from the house. You can't throw the dog and the kids in the car and take them to the vet because you don't want the kids seeing the real world. Okay, Simmy, maybe you're right, but why do you always choose the worst possible moments to go on this tirade? Look, I'm late for my meeting." "Okay, Simmy, but will you take the dog?" "Yes, I'll take the damn dog." The book was being passed around today, just as they used to pass the bottle. The shivering group stood on the sidewalk waiting for Simmy to open the doors to the church, but not waiting for Simmy to start the meeting. A pretty girl, too young to look as sad as she did, continued the recitation. 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Simmy headed down the path, out the gates to the garage. Parked next to Eve's slick silver this year's model car was Simmy's old car. Not old enough to be vintage, but still a very cool car. Simmy jumped in a peek and drove it up to the gates where Eve was waiting with the dog bundled in a blanket. Eve yelled at Simmy as she opened the passenger door. "Simmy, I told you I'd bring Mr. Clampett around to the garage. What can you be thinking? I mean, driving the car right up to the gate? I mean, what if the twins were to see the car?" "Eve, don't start on me. Just put the damn dog in the car." Mr. Clampett stared up at them with a doleful look. Eve gently eased him into the passenger seat, shut the door, and Simmy sped off. Eve watched Simmy leave, biting her lip, agitated, terrified. Simmy drove fast down the winding country roads, instinctively keeping one hand on the poor dog, trying to comfort him, as though her touch alone could lessen his agony. Simmy shook her head. "Oh, sometimes I think I'm losing my mind. Other times I figure it's too late. I guess I already lost it." Within minutes, Simmy screeched into the parking lot of the vet's office and hurried inside, carrying Mr. Clampett bundled in an old quilt. A flurry of forms were filled out. The vet came out of the office, and she handed the bundled dog over to his caring arms. While just a few blocks away, a heaven-sent peaceful calm was settling down around the listeners. They stared at the man with the red hair and the shaking hands and the filthy clothes and the hope in his eyes. "May direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others." Simmy ran out of the vet's office and jumped in her car, speeding to her meeting, cussing a blue streak when some rude driver cut right in front of her. In her anger, she ended up cutting off the driver behind her. The driver behind her honked. Simmy bellowed at the rearview mirror. "Oh, shut up, you! Can't you see I didn't mean to cut you off? Everyone in this town is wired so tight it's like living on a powder keg." And now, a girl who looked like an angel, who had committed 2 felonies and was hoping to stay sober so that she wouldn't commit a 3rd, took the blue book. 10. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Simmy got into the left turn lane, but before she could turn on the arrow, a line of cars in the opposing lane kept turning and turning, even though their light had long since turned red. "Oh, damn it, what the hell kind of wagon train is this? Don't you see your light turned red? Your light turned red 10 minutes ago. Doesn't a red light in this town mean anything anymore? Why, the traffic in this city alone could drive a person to drink." And indeed, in that moment, Simmy wanted a drink. She really wanted a drink. And then, as Simmy tried to make a left turn on her yellow light that was turning red, an angry driver opposite her, who wanted nothing more than to go on his green light, drove into the intersection and crashed into Simmy. They both got out and started proceeding through the usual ritual, as, in the distance, they could hear the song of the sirens, and within minutes Simmy was filling out more forms. 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Oh, it didn't take too long, just long enough to make Simmy a half-hour late. She was about to crack completely when she drove up to the church, parked her car, and got out clutching her Bible. "Damn, I hate walking in late. Everyone gives me that look." 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of those steps, we try to carry this message to other alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. The church basement. The pressure had been just too much for Simmy. She stood up in front of her soulmate, shaking slightly. Then she sat down again, slumped in her chair, and broke down sobbing. "Truth is, it isn't just the situation I live in, and it's not just the dog, although Lord knows I hate to see poor old Mr. Clampett suffer like that. It's just that this is the anniversary of the day I lost my babies. And you're going to have to pardon me. I mean, you've all been patient. I know you've heard this story 100 times before. But if I don't get it out of my system every now and again, this pain, I feel like it's going to turn into something evil, something terrible, like a cancer. Anyway, this is the anniversary. Oh, such a happy word for such a terrible memory, isn't it? I know, it isn't the same thing poor Eve went through. I mean, she really lost her children forever. Gunned down like that.
But still, at least she had some, what's that word folks always use these days, closure. But you just can't imagine what it's like knowing my babies are out there somewhere, growing up, going to school. I sit on that front porch every night. I wonder what kind of lives they're living. and then when I get to missing them real bad, I think back on that day when I went to court, and I was hoping against hope that the judge would give me partial custody, baby visitation rights. Was that too much to ask? But the judge refused. I couldn't really blame him, not after what I did to those kids.
Simmy started sobbing with renewed vigor. Someone next to her handed her a tissue. She blew her nose.
And what makes it worst of all is, the bald truth is, I don't have anyone to blame but myself. No, sirree, I don't.
Simmy, 10 years younger, but looking far worse than she does now, haggard and thinner, drove a battered station wagon with her 3 children in the back seat. They were adorable, around 3, 5, and 7, but they wore stained, frayed clothes. Their hair was unkempt. Their hands and faces were dirty. They screamed and whined for their assorted wants in the back seat as Simmy bellowed at them.
Shut up! Shut up before I come back there and make you shut up!
But, Mommy, we're hungry. We didn't get any breakfast.
And whose fault is that? Didn't I tell you to have some shredded wheat before we left on our errands?
But there wasn't any milk, Ma. Shredded wheat without milk sticks in my throat.
Yeah, I'm not eating any more cereal with water, Ma. It tastes gross. Just be quiet before you make me get into an accident, and I promise when we get done with our errands, I'll stop by McDonald's and we can all have drive-through. Then will you be quiet?
Hey, Ma, can I get new soccer shoes? Everyone on the team's got new shoes, and Coach says I can't play without new shoes.
You don't need new shoes. Those hand-me-down shoes of Henry's are just fine.
No way, Mom. Those are basketball high tops. For soccer, you need different shoes.
They stopped at a light, and Simmy turned on them, her face ugly with rage.
How many times I gotta tell you to shut up and not bother me while I'm driving? If you don't shut up, not only will you not get any soccer shoes, you won't get any lunch either. Now what about that?
The children started to wail at this threat. Simmy had driven to a nasty part of town. She parked the car by a house with broken-down cars in the driveway and rusty, abandoned appliances and assorted junk in the front lawn. Simmy turned to the kids.
Now, I gotta go in and get my medicine. I'll just be a few minutes. This is not a safe part of town for little children to be in, so I want all 3 of you to stay in the car. Just don't get out, not for any reason, and you keep an eye on each other. I love you.
Jonesing Simmy jumped out and hurried to the front door. She knocked. A scumbag answered. He glanced around, his eyes darting around like a caged rat before he opened the torn screen door and let her in. And as this sordid encounter was taking place, a little old lady in a shabby living room, the bric-a-brac bearing a religious theme, peered through faded curtains as she watched Simmy go into the house, leaving her children behind in the locked station wagon. Inside, the scumbag, in a stained T-shirt and boxer shorts, plopped down on a ratty sofa, staring stupidly at the ancient TV set with its coat-hanger antenna, while Simmy rooted through her purse for the cash. As outside, in the station wagon, the kids were crying and fighting, their hunger and tension worsened by the very hot day. While meanwhile, back in hell, Simmy had found her cache of cash. She held the wad of bills out to the dealer, beaming proudly as though in coming up with the right amount she had actually accomplished something impressive.
$35, now hand it over. My kids are in the car whining for lunch. Seems like it's always something.
But the scumbag gave her a sly look. How could he get some of her hit?
Wait a minute, Sim. You aren't actually going to drive around in the car holding, are you? Especially in that piece of junk car you drive with the expired plates. Cops will pull you over for dead registration. They'll find the smack. They'll lock your ass up. And the next McHappy meal your kids eat will be in the McJuvenile Detention Center while the cops try to figure out what the hell to do with them. Kids in jail? No, I think you better shoot up here, Sim. It's way safer. Oh, Baba, I don't know what. Hey, honey, haven't I always looked out for your best interest? Besides, babe, you look bad, like you're long overdue for a booster shot. Ain't that the truth? Hank was yelling this morning because he couldn't find a clean shirt. Joy was throwing up because she's always putting weird shit in her mouth. Threw me totally off schedule. I know. I almost didn't wait for you. Here, give me your arm. Simmy obeyed. He tied it, tapped for a vein, and injected her. She leaned back, smiling, letting the feeling flood through her. He grinned, prepared himself an injection, and did the same. But on the other side of the street, a nosy little old lady next door was peering out the window still, concerned about those kids in the station wagon. She craned her neck out of her screen door at the blazing sun. Must have been 100 degrees today. It wasn't even noon yet, and God knows how long those weirdos in that roach trap house would be. No telling how long is right. Simmy and the scumbag were lolling on the sofa, too high to get carnal, each drifting, meandering in their own little Chase the Dragon universe. When after a timeless time, how much time had gone by, Simmy wondered dimly, dumbly. All my children had ended. They were well into one life to live. Simmy remembered that much. Sirens. Police cars screeched up to the ramshackle house. Inside, Simmy and the scumbag were suddenly alert, as outside, some of the cops rushed to the station wagon to rescue the kids, while others burst into the pusher's place. Simmy and the scumbag were arrested and led away. A courtroom. Simmy sat, terrified, contrite, and sober, looking worse than ever next to her public defender. At the other table sat her husband and his lawyer. The judge pounded his gavel. Custody is hereby awarded to Mr. Parrish. Symphony Parrish's request for visitation rights is hereby denied. And with a pound of his gavel, Simmy lost her reason for living. And the next day, Simmy, shaky in her sobriety, waved goodbye to her children, who sat in their father's truck as he drove them out of Simmy's life forever. And now we fade to a different front porch. Same lady, different front porch. Simmy had returned from her meeting, where she'd had a marathon cry and about a dozen snickerdoodles. What she really wanted was a Manhattan. And now, as she sat on the porch swing, she was softly crying. She tried to collect herself when she heard the twins toddle out, fresh from their bath. They looked at her with great concern.
Simmy, what's wrong? You're crying. Did something make you sad?
No, babies, I was just thinking about how happy I am to be here with you, how lucky I am that I get to take care of you. Give me a hug. And they did. When Mary pulled away, she looked at Simmy.
So, is Mr. Clampett really going to be okay?
Simmy nodded, kissing Mary's hair still wet from her bath. Fine, he's going to be fine. Vet says he's just going to watch over him for a few days. They curled up next to her. She hugged them close. Eve came out to the porch and smiled at Simmy. Thank you, Simmy, for today. Thanks for everything. They all sat a moment, taking in the sunset. Simmy looked at the twins. How about you kids go in and get my shawl? As soon as the twins were gone, Simmy whispered to Eve, Eve, are you sure you want to stay here tonight? Something about this place, it's got bad juju on this night of all nights. Like those high stone walls are just taunting the bad spirits to see if the devil can scale them. Eve couldn't help but laugh. Listen to you talk, Simmy. You sound like some New Orleans voodoo queen. You know what I mean, Eve. There's some real bad kids in this city. I wouldn't put it past them to come out here to the country on a prowl. And don't you think those fortress walls you had built with the intention of keeping them out are just high enough to make getting in seem like a challenge? Kind of challenge some drunk kid would like to take? Those walls, with all the security systems in check, Simmy, nothing short of a Navy SEAL could scale those walls. And oh, so close by, Joe,
perched in a birch, was taking it all in through his binoculars. He smiled at these words from Eve. You see, among his other extraordinary talents, he could read lips. He watched the conversation. He could feel Eve's heavy sigh. Oh, Simmy, I will admit, this is the one night a year I feel trapped. But what am I supposed to do exactly? How do you suggest that I get out of here with the children, but without the twins getting a glimpse of the real world, without them finding out there's more out there than just a bunch of Amish folks churning butter? Stop being purposely cruel, Simmy. Now it's you who's acting beneath yourself. Well, we'll just have to say a prayer and hope for the... Oh, well, whatever. You see, watchers, tonight it is Halloween night, but there was no sign of it in this house. Instead, after dinner, hummus, soup, and flatbread, oh boy. Simmy had laid out the arts and crafts supplies, and Eve was sitting in the middle of it all with the twins, who looked up at her eagerly. Eve put her arms around them. You two realize what happens in just 8 weeks, right? Remember what is just 2 short months away?
Christmas!
The twins shouted together. Eve nodded, beaming. And you know what that means.
Presents!
Well, yes, presents, but not just getting presents, giving presents. Well, that's half the fun, you know. And meanwhile, the other half of the fun was going on just a few blocks away as a surly, drunk bunch of punks prepared for this night's holiday, a party with the devil. They were gathered in a stoner's bedroom, classic devil worshipper decor, lots of black skulls, posters of satanic rock groups. They were putting on ghoulish costumes, painting their faces, although, frankly, their parents would have told you that they didn't look that different than they did the other 364 days a year. One was a skeleton, one was the Grim Reaper. They painted their faces skull white, blood red, angel of death black. They giggled and jabbered about their wicked agenda for the night. How ironic, then, that Simmy should be painting the twins' faces, since they were clamoring for it. It was absolutely their favorite thing, face painting, although children in painted faces and costumes always seemed to disturb Eve.
Mommy, remember last year when we went down to the Amish folk and we dressed up in costumes?
Yes, I do.
Oh, Mom, that was so fun. Dirk and I were Christmas elves, and you went as a winter forest fairy dressed in white and silver. It was so magical.
Eve and Dirk and Mary and Simmy chuckled at the memory. But a wicked cackle overtakes their chuckles as we, the watchers, peer through the windows at another home into a dark basement. The satanic punks grabbed their supplies for the night, stashing them in duffel bags, eggs, toilet paper, spray paint. As the twins started to paint in a far more benign way, Eve was helping them with a Christmas mural, fighting the memories of this night. But we want to make sure we're ready, right, kids? Well, that's why we always spend this last night of October celebrating the beginning of the Christmas season. 2 wonderful months to prepare ourselves for the coming of the Christ child. The punks jumped into a battered-up black Mercury and screeched out of a lower-middle-class house into the street, into the darkness. The punk dressed as the devil whooped and hollered, "Hoo-hoo! Party! Mang, it's Halloween!" His buddy cracked a couple of beers. "Fucking A, man, we are gonna raise a goddamn devil tonight! Woo-hoo!" Back at the cozy home, the children were painting marionette heads, and Simmy was sewing tiny clothes for the puppets. Dirk's area was a mess, but Mary was neat, almost unnaturally so for a 7-year-old.
For Ruth, I'm making a shepherdess puppet. Mom, can we figure out how to make some sheep marionettes to go with the shepherdess?
I'm sure we can, Mary. What do you think, Simmy? We'll stuff a sock, then glue some cotton balls on it.
Yeah, and glue on a little tail and some sheep eyes.
Well, yeah, baby, we'll make a fine sheep marionette to give your little friend Ruth. Amish country. And the real live sheep were asleep, but roused at the sound of a car engine roaring down the dirt road. A creepy, high-pitched, cackling laugh cut through the peaceful Amish countryside as the punks went after the sheep with BB guns. Several sheep were hit in the face and the eyes and made the most horrific sheep shriek sounds. It was heart-wrenching
Dirk, what about you? What are you going to make?
I'm going to make a knight in shining armor, like Simmy read to us in the tales of King Arthur, or maybe a cowboy or an Indian. I don't know, Mom. I can't decide.
A quaint old barn. The drunk boys swilled the last of the six-pack as they tossed the empty cans into the field and jumped on the startled horses. They managed to hang on as they galloped around the barn and the house, whooping and hollering. Oh, Dirk, you could make all three. One for Josh, one for Caleb, one for Joseph. Well, you don't want any of your friends to feel left out, do you? That's why we start so early, honey, so we have time to make lots and lots and... In fact, Eve halted. She stared at the fire wistfully. In fact, you know what, twins? I think we should make this the best Christmas ever. The punks grabbed pumpkins from the front porch of an Amish house and tossed them through windows, the glass shattering the still of the night. They giggled and galloped back to the road, jumped off the horses and into their Mercury, screeching off just as the terrified Amish came running to the front door in their nightclothes. The drunken punks were singing along with Ozzy Osbourne as they sped towards the high stone walls. The twins were singing a little Christmas song as they tested out their marionettes. And meanwhile, in a dark basement in another part of the county, satanic music blared from speakers as another gang, a second gang, got ready for their night of demonic destruction. But their plans appeared more sinister. Guns, knives, an assortment of weapons to wreak havoc. They tooted up before leaving. As Eve and the twins munched ginger snaps and sipped hot cider as Simmy put a new batch of cookies in the oven. The black Mercury screeched to a stop just outside the high stone walls. The punks whooped and hollered as they jumped out of the car, armed with their weapons, a dozen cans of spray paint. Oh, have you ever seen a wall just crying out to be tagged, man? Wow, it's like a fucking virgin. How the fuck do you know what a virgin is like, man? Only virgin in our neighborhood is the Virgin Mary in St. Cecilia Church. Hey, what should we write, man? I've been thinking about that. We've been writing shit all over town. This wall is too beautiful for just fucking writing on, man. This wall is my canvas, pendejo, and I am fucking Picasso. But, a whole mural, man? What about the cops? You know that call I made back at the liquor store? Don't you know what I was doing, man? I called in a bomb scare at the community center. That party that got going on for all the little kiddies. Shit, you planted a bomb at the community center with all those kids? No, pendejo, don't you listen? I just called in a scare. Jazz like that will draw the cops for miles around, long enough for me to finish my masterpiece. He grabbed a couple of cans of spray paint and handed one to his buddy. I figure we start with black and red, a tribute to Satan. Skulls, corpses, a big devil in the middle with a pentagram, a fucking work of art. And oh, so close by in the cozy home, the twins were engaged in a masterpiece of their own, the pastoral background for the puppet theater that was to be a backdrop for the marionette's adventures. The little shepherdess, the knight in shining armor, the Indian, the cowboy, the princess, the wizard. The satanic masterpiece was sprawling out in all directions, a nightmare of skulls, epithets, swastikas, graffiti, pornographic images, even Hitler's face in the center of it all. The punks giggled and cussed gleefully, congratulating each other on their talents as Black Sabbath roared from the car speakers. When suddenly, the old pickup screeched up and a second gang got out, the guys that we, the watchers, saw gathering the more deadly cache of toys. What the fuck are you doing here, man? You know you don't belong around here. That's right, man. This is our turf. Hey, fuck you, man. Our turf is wherever we fucking say it is. And then the leader of the gang in the truck saw what his rivals had done to the high stone walls. Oh, man, that does it. This wall was fucking ours, man. It was a thing of beauty. Yeah, we had plans for it. Oh, did you, man? Well, maybe we got plans for you, asshole. Yeah, maybe we have plans for you, asshole, to gangbang your fucking mother, huh? She must be used to having two at once by now. The leader of the gang in the truck jumped out and stood yards from the other punks. You crossed the line, motherfucker!
and without so much as blinking an eye, he drew out a sawed-off shotgun, aimed and fired several shots into the punk, who jerked and spasmed, then died in a pool of his own blood. The shooter's buddies in the truck stared in disbelief. Then suddenly the shooter jumped in the truck and it screeched off. Meanwhile, the other punk ran to his buddy, shaking him, trying to shake him back to life. And then, headlights. A random car came by, and the punk waved his arms and screamed for help, covered in his friend's blood. But, of course, the car did not stop. Instead, it just sped off. Sirens. And inside the fortress, just as Simi and Eve were helping the twins into their jammies, they heard the sound, and Eve's blood ran cold. Oh, my God, sirens! The twins picked up on Eve's fear.
Mommy, what's that sound? I never heard anything like it before. Mommy, you look scared. You're making me scared too.
But once again, Simi was magical in her ability to short-circuit the panic. Oh, babies, that's nothing to be scared of. Remember you learned all about the sirens and the sailors when we read about Ulysses?
Oh, I remember. Is that what a siren sounds like?
Yeah, babies, it's kind of pretty, don't you think? It's nothing to be scared of at all.
It is kind of neat sounding.
As Simi talked, she watched over her shoulder as Eve calmed down, grateful for once again being rescued by Simi. And as Simi spun her story about the mythical sirens, the horror just outside those stone walls was unfolding in slow motion, as though it were something out of a Brian De Palma film. One punk was mourning his best friend, holding him in his arms, oblivious of the folks who drove by, heading home from happy Halloween festivities. Cars filled with costumed kiddios who leaned out and gawked at the real terror, the real blood and guts and gore, the real death. And then the arrival of the police and ambulance and morgue vehicle, bringing in their wake a symphony of screaming sirens, and all this against the backdrop of the satanic stone wall mural, the paint still as wet and red as the blood. But Simi was still soothing her darlings. Remember, Mary, I told you when we read about it how magical it was? You remember about the sirens?
Oh, yes, they were beautiful creatures who were birds, white birds with beautiful feathers, all colors of the rainbow, but with heads like ladies. Yeah, and they were so pretty, and their singing was enchanted, and that the sailors would stop steering their ships and crash into the rocks.
Yes, babies, but not Ulysses. Remember, he put wax in his ears so he could sail his ship safely past the sirens.
Listen, there's more of them, sirens. It sounds like they're flying over the cabin. Mommy, can we go outside and see? Yeah, can we go see them, Mommy?
No!
But it sounds like they're flying through the sky. Is that because they've got bird wings?
Yes, but they'll be gone soon. And then the twins, in a rare moment of spoiled brattiness, started screaming and crying.
We want to see the sirens. Why can't we see the sirens?
Because, babies, anyone who looks on a siren goes blind. You don't want to go blind now, do you, baby? The crime scene was finally quieting down. The ambulance was gone, the morgue vehicle was gone. All that were left were a couple of police cars who sat with their sirens off but their lights on. The sirens having flown away, the twins were finally drifting off to a deep sleep as Simi and Eve finished tucking them in. Then they slipped out to the back porch. Simi spoke before Eve had a chance. I know. I'll keep a watch on them in case they wake up. You go see what in God's name all of that was about. I'll say a prayer. Eve steeled herself, took a deep breath, and opened the forbidding black wrought iron gates. She walked out and came around the corner to where the wall wound around to the road. She gasped in horror when she saw the vicious art on her precious fortress walls. A policeman got out of his cruiser approaching Eve. And for a split second, the image of him approaching spun Eve back in time. She remembered another policeman getting out of another cruiser, walking towards Eve with the grimmest of expressions. But this was a younger Eve, a fresher, optimistic Eve in a corporate gray suit and heading into her office building. The policeman talked to her in low tones, and she collapsed in horror, sobbing. Moments later, she was screeching up to a schoolyard where a crowd had gathered and police were trying to push the screaming, crying parents and children away from the scene of the crime. As two officers gently held Eve back, she stared in horror at the pools of blood all over the playground behind the yellow police tape. And now, we, the watchers, fade with Eve back to the present, to a new nightmare. From inside the estate, through the bars of the gates, Joe watched, fascinated and helpless, as Eve stared at her defiled walls, then collapsed on the side of the road and wept. The policeman ran to help her, but Joe could not.